They called Benin the exception. The one democracy in West Africa that would not break. But on the night of December 7th, the exception shattered. The city moved as it always did. Markets winding down, motorcycles humming through Cotonou, families preparing for sleep. Nothing hinted that the country was minutes away from confronting the truth it had buried for years. Then gunfire erupted outside President Patrice Talon's residence, splitting the silence open like a wound. And in that moment, the myth collapsed. Benin, the so-called model of stability, was pulled into the same storm that had already engulfed its neighbors. A storm made of anger, exclusion, broken promises, and a system that had been tightening long before the first shot was fired. If this is the story they did not want you to hear, leave a like. Because tonight, the question is not why the coup happened, but why everyone thought it never could.
Dear compatriots, on this day, Sunday, December 7, 2025, we, the Defense and Security Forces, after careful consideration and to provide a point of reference for our country, have decided to assume our responsibilities following the multiple excesses of Mr. Patrice Talon's government. In terms of security, this concerns the continued deterioration of the security situation in northern Benin. The ignorance and negligence of the situation of our soul brothers who fell at the front and especially that of their families abandoned to their fate by the policies of Mr. Patrice Talon. Despite the many promises relayed with great fanfare in the media, the Military Committee for the Refoundation of the CMR has decided, 1. The Constitution of November 2025 is suspended. All institutions are dissolved. The activities of political parties are suspended until further notice.
Here is what unfolded. In the early hours of December 7th, soldiers from the Defense and Security Forces launched a coordinated attack on President Talon's residence. Minutes later, a group of armed officers appeared on national television, calling themselves the Military Committee for Refoundation. They announced that Talon had been removed, the constitution suspended, all institutions dissolved, political parties frozen, and the country's borders sealed. Lieutenant Colonel Pascal Tigre was declared the new head of state. But even as the message spread, forces loyal to Talon claimed they were regrouping and restoring control. In Benin, two governments seemed to exist at once. And the fight was no longer about power. It was about who still had the right to speak for the nation. To understand why the events of December 7th erupted with such force, you have to step back into the shadows where this crisis was quietly building. Because coups do not begin with soldiers. They begin with fractures. And in Benin, those fractures were widening long before the first shot echoed through Cotonou. The first signs appeared in 2024, when Benin arrested two of its most recognizable political figures, Oswald Homke, the former sports minister, and Olivier Boko, a businessman long considered close to President Patrice Talon. They were accused of plotting a coup alongside senior officers of the Presidential Guard. The case shocked the country. Was it a genuine conspiracy? Or an early purge meant to neutralize potential rivals? Whatever the truth, their 20-year prison sentences revealed a deeper truth: trust within the ruling elite had collapsed. And the system Talon had built was turning inward on itself. But political suspicion was only one layer of the storm. A far more immediate threat was rising in northern Benin. Since 2021, jihadist groups linked to Jamaat Nasr al-Islam wal Muslimin and to the Islamic State Sahel province have been creeping across the border. Attacks multiplied. Soldiers died in ambushes that barely made national news. Families spoke of promises that never materialized. Widows waited months for compensation that never arrived. Young officers whispered that promotions went to those connected to political figures, not to those who led men into danger. For a country praised as a model of security, the silence around the unfolding insurgency was unsettling. The north was bleeding. And Cotonou pretended the stain was temporary. The political climate darkened as well. Benin had once been praised as the democratic showcase of West Africa. But under Talon, elections tightened, opposition leaders were jailed or driven into exile. And new laws made it nearly impossible for independent political forces to compete. Critics said Benin still held elections, but no longer held choices. Even within the business community, there were whispers that Talon's reforms had turned into consolidation, that vital sectors of the economy were absorbed into networks loyal to the presidency. Public contracts followed predictable paths. State loans disappeared into opacity. Taxes rose sharply, hitting the poorest households while the powerful remained insulated. Ordinary citizens felt the cost. Civil servants lost their jobs in wide sweeps. Dialysis support programs were cut, leaving some of the country's most vulnerable to fend for themselves. Families broke under the pressure. Benin's economic growth looked impressive on graphs. But on the ground, people said the numbers did not match their lives. And then there was the question nobody dared to frame openly: what would happen in 2027? Talon had promised to step down. Yet the political environment suggested something else. His finance minister, Romuald Watani, was floated as the successor. Not by the people, not by an open political contest, but by a leader who appeared ready to govern through a proxy. For many Beninese, this looked like a rehearsed transfer of power, reminiscent of the Medvedev-Putin choreography in Russia, an exit that was not an exit. A resignation that preserved control. People sensed the performance. They sensed that democracy had become scripted. By late 2025, the pressure inside the system was no longer concealed. Soldiers felt abandoned. Citizens felt suffocated. The political elite felt uncertain. And Talon's circle, once tightly aligned, appeared fractured by suspicion, fear of retaliation, and anxiety about the coming transition. If you believe all of this was not accidental, but engineered by years of controlled politics and shrinking freedoms, tell me in the comments. Because this is not the story of one night. It is the story of a decade. Inside the military, frustration turned into something harder. Officers asked why their men were dying while decisions about strategy were centralized in offices far from the battlefield. They asked why corruption seemed protected, why loyalty to reform meant obedience rather than competence. When the Military Committee for Refoundation listed its grievances on national television, they were not improvising. They were reading aloud what many had whispered, that the security crisis was mishandled, that political institutions were hollow, that economic power was captured, that social programs had collapsed, and that the state no longer answered to its citizens. Yet this does not justify a coup. It explains the climate that made one possible. A democracy shrinks one rule at a time. One manipulated election at a time, one silenced voice at a time. And when citizens lose the ability to correct their leaders, the correction eventually comes from actors outside the democratic process. In Benin, that actor was the army. Still, the most important part of this story is not the grievances themselves, but how they converged. A fragmented elite. A rising insurgency. A strained society. An economy centralizing around a small circle. And a president preparing to step aside publicly while retaining influence privately. These were not separate events. They were links in the same chain, tightening year after year until something had to snap. December 7th was the sound of that chain breaking.
The Military Committee for Refoundation reassures that Benin's international commitments as well as human rights will be respected. Finally, the army solemnly undertakes to give the Beninese people hope for a truly new era where brotherhood, justice and work reign, a symbol of our national unity. Long live the soul. Long live the refoundation of our dear homeland. Long live Benin, the republic or death, the people first.
To understand the coup attempt in Benin, you must examine the architecture of power that held the country together, and the very seams where it eventually tore apart. Because in Benin, the crisis was not a sudden rupture. It was a slow unraveling of a system built around one man, one network, and one vision that no longer matched the country beneath it. At the center stood President Patrice Talon. Before entering politics, he was a businessman, a figure who built influence through commerce long before he built it through votes. When he became president, that background shaped the structure of his governance. Power was streamlined. Decision-making became vertical. Economic reforms were aggressive, sometimes applauded internationally, yet increasingly criticized at home for favoring a narrow circle around the presidency. What looked like efficiency to outsiders was often experienced as consolidation by those inside the system. Around Talon, a network formed. It was not a single conspiracy, not a coordinated cabal, but a constellation of allies in business, administration, and politics who benefited from the order he created. Contracts flowed through predictable channels. Regulatory bodies aligned themselves with executive choices. Critics said the economy was being captured, a claim that became harder to dismiss as more sectors concentrated under figures tied to the presidency. Talon did not hide his ambition for transformation. But the transformation came with a price. Loyalty became currency, and those outside the circle found themselves increasingly irrelevant. This brings us to Romuald Watani. The finance minister was never officially designated as Talon's successor. But the signs were unmistakable. His rise was steady. His visibility grew. Policies reflected the administration's priorities, not as an independent force but as an extension of the executive's will. Many in Benin saw Watani not as a leader in waiting, but as the vessel through which Talon could continue shaping the country long after leaving office. For a public already concerned about shrinking political competition, this looked less like a democratic transition and more like a succession plan crafted behind closed doors. But power rarely remains uncontested. Beneath the surface, other networks existed. Former ministers, influential businessmen, political figures sidelined by Talon's centralization of authority. The case of Oswald Homke and Olivier Boko exposed this tension. Their arrest in 2024 was presented as the uncovering of a coup plot. Yet many questioned whether it was a preemptive strike by the presidency to neutralize factions that had grown too independent. Their long prison sentences demonstrated one thing clearly: the ruling system was no longer simply managing dissent. It was fearing it. And then there was the military, the most misunderstood component of Benin's political machinery. Under Talon, the armed forces were modernized in structure but marginalized in influence. Promotions raised eyebrows. High-performing officers were overlooked. Older, experienced commanders were pushed into retirement. Many soldiers believed their institution was being reshaped not for strength but for loyalty. When the security crisis in the north intensified, these frustrations multiplied. Soldiers were dying. Communities were under attack. Yet strategic control remained tightly centralized, and military voices often felt excluded from real decision-making. A military that feels ignored is not always a military that rebels. But it becomes a military that listens when others question the legitimacy of power. Which brings us to the Military Committee for Refoundation, the group that appeared on national television on December 7. They named Lieutenant Colonel Pascal Tigri as their leader. But no one believes Tigri acted alone. The operation required coordination, intelligence, and timing that few mid-ranking officers could execute without broader backing. The question is not who read the statement. It is who wrote it. Some analysts argue that the coup attempt may have been supported by factions that once benefited from Talon's governance but later found themselves displaced. As Talon tightened control and prepared for a controlled transition, these groups realized that the future held no guarantee for them. They understood the cost of being outside the next circle of power. And they acted to prevent a political arrangement that they believed would lock them out permanently. Others point to internal divisions within the army. Officers who felt betrayed by years of mismanagement in the north may have joined forces with political actors who saw the 2027 transition as a threat to their influence. It would not be the first time in West African politics that a coup emerged not from ideological revolt but from a collision of interests. Meanwhile, the Talon administration maintained its own network of loyalists. including portions of the Defense and Security Forces and the National Guard. The split between those who supported the coup and those who rejected it explains why, in the hours following the announcement, Benin appeared to have two governments. It was not just a power struggle. It was a struggle between networks, each believing that the other represented an existential threat. But at the heart of this crisis lies a fundamental question: what happens when a system built on centralized authority loses its balance? Benin's institutions did not collapse because they were weak. They collapsed because they were concentrated, increasingly dependent on the decisions of a small circle rather than the resilience of a broad and inclusive democratic framework. When those within the circle fractured, the system had no cushion. It simply cracked. This is why the coup attempt was not surprising to those who understood the internal dynamics of Benin. The political class was divided. The business elite was uncertain. The military was frustrated. And the president was preparing a transition that many believed would preserve his influence at the expense of broader political renewal. All these tensions converged in one moment, producing a rupture that had been years in the making. December 7th was not a rebellion against democracy. It was the collapse of a political architecture whose foundation had been eroding for far too long. The events in Benin did not happen in isolation. They did not erupt in a vacuum or emerge from a uniquely Beninese flaw. To understand what happened on December 7th, you must widen the frame. Because the story of Benin is also the story of West Africa itself, a region wrestling with the collapse of political models that no longer match the realities on the ground. Over the last 6 years, the map of West Africa has been redrawn not by borders, but by power. Guinea fell in 2021. Burkina Faso in 2022. Niger in 2023. Guinea-Bissau shook in 2023 with attempted military interventions. Others faced attempted coups, armed rebellions, or constitutional crises. One by one, the pillars of what the international community once called democratic stability fractured under the weight of their own contradictions. Benin was supposed to be the exception. It was the country cited in policy reports. The country praised for reforms, credited with growth, and held up as a model for governance in a region defined by volatility. But the praise masked a deeper trend. The nations that collapsed did not collapse because they lacked elections. They collapsed because elections alone could not carry the weight of economic despair. Inequality, insecurity, and leadership that treated democracy as a label rather than a responsibility. Nowhere is this clearer than in the Sahel, the vast stretch of land just north of Benin. There, jihadist groups have exploited weak governance, porous borders, and social grievances. They have defeated armies, toppled local administrations, and reduced entire regions to zones of fear. Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger responded by forming the alliance of Sahel states, turning inward, rejecting old partnerships, and attempting to build a security model rooted in survival rather than diplomatic approval. Benin did not join the alliance, but it did not stand outside the crisis either. Northern Benin became a spillover zone, struck by the very groups that destabilized its neighbors. Villages lived under threat, farmers abandoned fields, soldiers died in ambushes. As insecurity rose, faith in the government's message of stability weakened. People saw that borders on maps did not stop the spread of violence. They saw that political speeches did not protect them. They saw that a state could be democratic on paper and powerless in practice. Across the region, this tension between promise and reality created a new political logic. When governments became too distant, too rigid, or too insulated from public pressure, the military stepped in. Not because coups produced better outcomes, but because institutions had become too hollow to absorb conflict and too concentrated to distribute responsibility. In these countries, democracy became a performance, and the audience stopped believing the script. If you see Benin as part of a larger regional pattern rather than an isolated event, tell me in the comments. Because the deeper truth is that the coup attempt in Benin is not the first shock. It is the echo of a shock that started long ago. International observers have long misunderstood this wave of instability. They attribute it to military ambition, foreign interference, or institutional weakness. But the real drivers are far more human: frustration, humiliation, despair, and the belief that the political class no longer serves the people. When elections do not lead to change, when institutions protect the powerful, when the social contract collapses, people begin to see the military not as a threat, but as the only remaining actor capable of forcing a reset. That is the dangerous part. Not because militaries are inherently repressive, but because the collapse of democracy leaves a vacuum that no institution can fill neatly. Coups provide rupture, not direction. They expose the failure of the system, but they do not repair it. This is the paradox of the region: the military is called to solve problems created by civilians, but in doing so inherits the very structures that produced the crisis. Benin now stands at the same crossroads that faced Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Each of these countries responded differently. Some embraced sovereignty narratives. Others purged institutions, others recalibrated alliances. Yet all discovered the same truth: once the illusion of stability cracks, it cannot be restored by force alone. Stability must be rebuilt, not declared. And while Benin has not joined the alliance of Sahel states, the shadow of that alliance hangs over the region. It represents a political identity formed around rupture, the rupture with foreign influence, with old elites, with institutions that citizens no longer trust. Whether one agrees with the alliance or not, its existence marks the emergence of a philosophy that rejects the old order. For some Beninese, especially in the north, the appeal of such narratives is growing. They want security that works, governance that listens, and leaders who do not treat power as inheritance. The coup attempt in Benin is therefore not simply a national event. It is a regional symptom. It is a reflection of a broader crisis of legitimacy in West Africa, where governments have failed to translate growth into opportunity, elections into representation, and sovereignty into safety. And as long as those failures persist, the storms that swept through the Sahel will continue drifting outward, touching countries once thought immune. Benin was the last country people expected to fall into this cycle. But the cycle was never about expectation. It was about pressure. Pressure from insecurity. Pressure from inequality. Pressure from political exclusion. Pressure from a population that sees leaders rotating but outcomes staying the same. This is the context in which December 7th must be understood, not as an isolated coup, but as the moment Benin entered the turbulence that has reshaped the political horizon of an entire region. And the question now is not whether the region is changing. It is whether Benin will change with it, or be changed by it. There is one possibility that has not been said aloud, not by the soldiers on television, not by government officials, and not by analysts who fear the implications. Yet it is the possibility that fits the facts too neatly to ignore. What if the coup attempt in Benin was not simply a revolt by frustrated officers? What if it was the opening move in a struggle between elites who built the system, benefited from the system, and finally decided they could no longer survive inside the system? Because the closer you look, the stranger the timing becomes. The arrest of Oswald Homke and Olivier Boko in 2024 was framed as the dismantling of a coup plot. But what if it was a preview of something much broader, a silent civil war inside the elite? What if the same networks that once supported Talon had already begun splitting, calculating, choosing sides long before December 7th? The signs were there. Talon's consolidation of power had alienated older political families, influential business actors, and members of the presidential circle who once shaped national decisions but now found themselves pushed to the margins. The planned transition of 2027, with Romuald Watani rising as the chosen successor, threatened to lock them out permanently. A controlled succession is safe only for the one who controls it. For everyone else, it is a wall closing in. Meanwhile, the military was waiting, bitter, overlooked, fractured by losses in the north. Not angry enough to revolt on its own, but angry enough to listen. Angry enough to become the instrument of someone else's plan. And that is where the twist lies. The coup attempt may not have been designed by the military. It may have been engineered by the very civilian factions that once upheld Talon's rule. A revolt not from below, but from within. A reset initiated by those who feared the future more than they feared instability. Lieutenant Colonel Pascal Tigre, the face of the uprising, might not be its architect. Coup statements rarely reveal their authors. They reveal their messengers. And a messenger with a uniform is easier to legitimize than a politician with a grievance. If this theory is true, the implications are extraordinary. It means December 7th was not simply a collapse of democracy. It was the collapse of a pact among elites. It means the country was not taken by force. It was released by agreement. Not a coup against a president, but a coup against a future designed to exclude too many of those who once held power. And above all, it means this crisis will not be solved on the streets or in barracks. Because it did not begin there. It began in boardrooms, in private homes, in whispered conversations between men who believed the system they helped build had grown too tight even for them. The real struggle for Benin is not between soldiers and the state. It is between competing visions of who gets to command the next era of power. This is not the fall of a government. It is the fracture of an order. Benin wakes to a fragile calm, a country pretending that normal life can simply resume. But beneath the morning routines lies a nation that has crossed a threshold it cannot uncross. The coup attempt did not destroy Benin's democracy. It revealed how long it had already been hollowed out, how far power had drifted from the people it claimed to represent. And now the country stands suspended between what it was and what it must become. In the days ahead, others will argue about winners and losers, about legality and loyalty, about who should rule and who should step aside. But those debates miss the deeper truth: the crisis in Benin is not about a president or a committee. It is about the right of citizens to shape their own future, without fear, without exclusion, without the illusion of choice. Moments like this define nations. They either bury the truth or expose it. And once exposed, the truth does not return quietly to its box. If you believe these stories matter, if you refuse to let this moment be forgotten, then like, comment, and subscribe. Not for me, but for every voice in Benin that has never been allowed to speak until now.